My name is Sienna Marlowe. I'm 24 years old. 8 months. That's how long I shared a small 2-bedroom apartment with someone I believed was becoming one of my closest friends. For 8 months, we lived ordinary lives together. We split grocery bills. We argued over whose turn it was to take the trash out. We complained about work while eating takeout on the couch. We laughed over terrible reality TV shows neither of us would ever admit to watching if someone asked. And almost every single night, after my regular job ended, I opened my laptop at our tiny kitchen table and worked on the project that would eventually change my life. Or at least, I thought it was going to change my life. While I typed thousands of lines of code, she sat only a few feet away. Sometimes she answered emails from work. Sometimes she scrolled through her phone. Sometimes she just watched. She watched quietly enough that I never questioned it. When she asked questions, I answered every single one. How much would the subscription cost? Why did I organize the interface that way? How did I decide which features to prioritize? Who were my competitors? How many users did I think I needed before investors would take me seriously? At the time, those questions made me feel supported. Looking back, they weren't conversations, they were research. 3 days before the biggest presentation of my life, she packed everything she owned into cardboard boxes, hugged me goodbye, and told me she'd accepted an amazing opportunity in another city. I helped carry those boxes downstairs. I even wished her luck. 2 weeks later, I watched her stand on another stage. Different audience, different investors, different company name. My idea, my pricing, my research, my market analysis, my words, even my favorite sentence from my own pitch deck. She delivered it with complete confidence, as if every late night, every sacrifice, every ounce of exhaustion belonged to her instead of me. She thought she had timed everything perfectly. She thought she had disappeared before I would ever realize what she'd been doing. What she didn't know was that one of the investors listening to her presentation had already spent 4 months helping me build that exact pitch. Some lies collapse because people confess. Others collapse because they underestimate how many witnesses they've accidentally created. If you're already wondering how someone could spend 8 months pretending to be your friend while quietly stealing everything you were building, subscribe before we go any further. And if you're listening somewhere in the world right now, tell me your city and your local time in the comments. I genuinely read every one. Because stories like mine remind me that betrayal doesn't belong to one place. It happens everywhere. Now, let me take you back to where all of this really started. I grew up in Asheville, North Carolina. It's one of those places people describe as charming before they've actually lived there. Tree-lined streets, coffee shops on corners, artists selling paintings downtown, tourists who visit for a weekend and assume life there must always feel peaceful. For me, it was simply home. Not perfect, not terrible, just home. My parents divorced when I was 7 years old. People always ask whether it was messy. The truth is, it wasn't. Not in the dramatic way people imagine. There were no screaming matches that I remember, no broken dishes, no police cars. Instead, it happened quietly. Quiet enough that I didn't fully understand my family had fallen apart until months after it already had. My father moved into an apartment across town. My mother threw herself into work. Both of them loved me. I believe that. Even now, I believe that. But love and presence aren't always the same thing. Some people disappear physically. Others disappear emotionally while standing right in front of you. My parents did a little of both. The person who truly raised me was my grandmother. Her name was Eleanor. She owned a neighborhood bakery for almost 30 years. If you've never walked into a bakery at 5 o'clock in the morning, it's difficult to explain the feeling. The world outside is still dark. Most people are asleep. But inside, everything already feels alive. Warm bread, butter melting, the smell of cinnamon hanging in the air, mixers humming, ovens opening and closing. Customers wouldn't arrive for hours, but the work always started before sunrise. When I was little, she'd bring me with her before school. I'd sit behind the counter with my homework spread across a table dusted in flour. Sometimes she'd quiz me on multiplication while frosting cupcakes. Sometimes I'd read novels while watching people stop in before work for coffee and fresh pastries. I didn't realize it then, but those mornings shaped the way I saw the world. Nobody handed my grandmother that bakery. She built it. Every customer trusted her because she'd earned that trust one morning at a time. She never rushed, never cut corners, never complained about how difficult running a small business was. She simply showed up, again and again and again. One afternoon, when I couldn't have been older than 10, I remember asking her why she worked so hard. She smiled without looking up from the pie she was making. "Because," she said, "the easiest thing in the world is wanting something." She pressed the dough into the pan carefully. The hard part is showing up every day after the excitement disappears. I didn't understand that sentence then. Years later, it became the sentence I repeated to myself every time I wanted to quit, especially during the nights when nobody believed in my idea yet. Especially during the nights when I wasn't even sure I believed in it myself. School came easily enough, not because I was naturally brilliant, I wasn't. I simply learned early that consistency beats talent far more often than people like admitting. I wasn't the smartest kid in class. I wasn't the most outgoing. I wasn't the person winning every academic competition. But if something mattered to me, I'd keep working after everyone else got bored. That habit followed me into college. I attended Appalachian State University and studied computer science. Whenever people hear computer science, they imagine someone who spent childhood taking computers apart. That wasn't me. I didn't write my first meaningful piece of code until high school. What fascinated me wasn't computers themselves, it was problem solving. The realization that you could build something from absolutely nothing. One blank screen. One idea. Thousands of tiny decisions. Eventually, something real existed where nothing had existed before. That felt almost magical to me. College wasn't glamorous. I wasn't one of those students launching startups from my dorm room. I wasn't winning hackathons. I wasn't graduating at the top of my class. Honestly, my grades were fine. Not embarrassing, not impressive, just fine. Sometimes I worried that fine was becoming the story of my entire life. Fine grades, fine internships, fine opportunities. Nothing terrible, nothing extraordinary. When I graduated in 2023, I accepted a junior developer position at a small software consultancy in Charlotte. Everyone congratulated me. Good salary, benefits, career growth. The kind of job parents proudly tell relatives about during holidays. For the first few months, I convinced myself I'd made it. I rented a small apartment, bought decent furniture, started paying my own bills without panicking every month. From the outside, everything looked exactly the way success is supposed to look in your 20s. Inside, something felt missing. I spent 40 hours every week building products I didn't care about for companies I'd never heard of before they hired us. Insurance portals, scheduling systems, corporate dashboards. Every Monday looked like the previous Monday. Every Friday felt like reaching the surface after spending 5 days underwater. My coworkers were nice people. My manager treated me fairly. Nothing was objectively wrong. But every evening I'd drive home wondering the same thing. Is this it? Is this what I worked so hard for? I couldn't imagine spending the next 40 years improving software that meant absolutely nothing to me. At the time, though, I didn't have an alternative. Until my grandmother got sick. It didn't happen suddenly. There wasn't one dramatic diagnosis that changed everything overnight. Instead, it arrived slowly. Small memory lapses, missed medications, appointments getting confused, family members assuming someone else had already called her. Everyone cared. Everyone wanted to help. But helping became strangely complicated. My mother texted updates. My uncle preferred phone calls. One cousin insisted on using email. Another created a shared calendar nobody actually checked. Medication reminders lived inside one app, doctor appointments inside another, emergency contacts somewhere else. Notes about symptoms were scattered across group chats. Every week felt like solving a puzzle using pieces from 5 different boxes. I remember sitting in my car after yet another exhausting afternoon trying to coordinate one simple doctor's appointment. I stared at my phone. 5 apps open, 3 unread text chains, calendar notifications, prescription reminders, voicemails. It was chaos. Not because any individual tool was bad, because none of them worked together. And somewhere between frustration and exhaustion, a thought quietly appeared. There has to be a better way. At first, it wasn't a business idea, not even close. I wasn't dreaming about investors, or funding, or startups. I simply wanted my family to stop missing medication schedules because information kept getting lost between different apps. That was it. That night, after work, I opened my laptop. Instead of watching television, instead of playing games, instead of relaxing, I started sketching ideas. Not code, just boxes, buttons, little arrows showing how information might flow. One screen for medications, one for appointments, one shared family timeline. Simple, clean, easy enough that someone in their 70s wouldn't need an instruction manual. I kept asking myself one question. What would make Grandma smile instead of sigh? That became the design philosophy for everything that followed. Not, what would impress software engineers? Not, what would look futuristic? Just, what would make this easier for her? I had absolutely no idea that one decision would eventually create something worth stealing. I had absolutely no idea that one decision would eventually create something worth stealing. The first version of the app was embarrassingly simple. If anyone saw it today, they'd probably laugh. There were no polished animations, no beautiful branding, no clever onboarding sequence. The buttons were uneven. The colors didn't match. The interface looked like something a college student would build over a long weekend, fueled by too much coffee. Because that's exactly what it was. But it worked. At least, it solved my problem. For the first time, my grandmother's medication schedule, doctor's appointments, and family updates all lived in one place. Nothing revolutionary, nothing investors would have gotten excited about. Just one clean dashboard that reduced the number of places everyone had to check before calling her. The first time I handed my grandmother my phone and showed her how to use it, I was nervous. Technology wasn't something she particularly enjoyed. She could text, she could answer calls. Anything more complicated than that usually ended with one of us driving over to fix something that had never actually been broken. She adjusted her reading glasses and stared at the screen. I just press this? That's it. And this tells me what pills I already took? Yes. She tapped the button. The medication disappeared from the list. She looked at me for a few seconds. Then she smiled. Oh. That was it. Just, oh. But I knew that smile. It was the same smile she'd worn when I was little and finally learned long division after struggling for weeks. It wasn't excitement. It was relief. For her, the app wasn't software. It was one less thing she had to remember. One less thing she had to worry about. Sometimes the smallest victories feel the biggest. A few weeks later, her home health aide stopped by while I happened to be visiting. Her name was Denise. She'd worked with elderly patients for years, and within 5 minutes of watching my grandmother use the app, she looked at me with genuine curiosity. "Did you buy this?" I laughed. "No." "I built it." She blinked. "You built this yourself?" I nodded. She asked if she could try it. I handed her my phone. She spent nearly 10 minutes clicking through every screen. When she finished, she looked back at me. I have 2 other families that would absolutely use something like this. I remember pretending to stay calm. Oh, really? Absolutely. She wasn't being polite. She wasn't trying to encourage me. She genuinely meant it. That conversation stayed with me for days. Not because she had complimented my work, because she'd unknowingly answered the question I hadn't been brave enough to ask myself. Maybe this wasn't only my problem. Maybe thousands of other families were dealing with the exact same chaos. That possibility sat quietly in the back of my mind for weeks. During lunch breaks at work, I'd jot ideas into my notebook. Driving home, I'd dictate feature ideas into my phone before I forgot them. Late at night, I'd test tiny improvements that probably no one else would ever notice. Every update made the app feel a little more real, a little more useful, a little less like a personal side project. Still, I wasn't calling it a startup. Not yet. That word felt too big, too ambitious. People hear startup and immediately picture 20-something founders standing on stages in expensive sneakers, talking about changing the world. I was eating leftover pasta at midnight while debugging calendar notifications. Those felt like 2 very different universes. Around that same time, my apartment lease was coming to an end. Charlotte wasn't exactly cheap, and renewing the lease alone would have stretched my budget more than I was comfortable with, so I started looking for a roommate. I spent several evenings scrolling through roommate-matching websites. Some listings immediately ruled themselves out. One person wanted complete silence after 8 p.m. Another had 3 large dogs. Someone else described themselves as a professional DJ practicing from home. That was an easy no. Then I found Paige Whitfield's listing. Her profile was straightforward. 26. Worked in marketing for a regional consumer goods company. Clean. Non-smoker. Enjoyed cooking. Preferred quiet weeknights. The pictures looked normal. Nothing flashy. Nothing suspicious. We agreed to meet at a coffee shop before making any decisions. I almost canceled. Not because of anything she'd done. I just hate meeting strangers. Always have. There's something strangely exhausting about trying to determine whether someone is trustworthy during a 1-hour conversation. She arrived exactly on time. Dark blazer, hair pulled back, laptop bag over one shoulder. She apologized because traffic had been worse than expected, even though she wasn't actually late. That tiny detail made an unexpectedly good first impression. People who apologize for things they don't need to apologize for usually care about how they affect others. Or at least, that was my theory then. We ordered coffee, talked for nearly 2 hours, not just about rent, about work, college, books, travel, terrible bosses, favorite restaurants. She had an easy way of asking questions that made conversations feel effortless. She listened, really listened. She remembered details. When I mentioned growing up in Asheville, she asked about the bakery. When I mentioned my grandmother, she wanted to know what kind of pastries she made. When I joked about surviving on frozen pizza during college finals, she laughed like she'd had exactly the same experience. Nothing felt forced. Driving home afterward, I caught myself thinking, this might actually work. A week later, she moved in. The apartment wasn't anything special. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a living room barely big enough for our couch, a tiny kitchen where opening both cabinet doors at once was almost impossible. But it was ours. Or at least, it felt that way. Living with Paige was surprisingly easy. She cleaned up after herself, paid bills on time, never left dishes in the sink. If one of us ordered takeout, we'd usually ask if the other wanted anything. Little things, ordinary things, the kind of habits that slowly convince you someone is dependable. Looking back now, I replay those months constantly, searching for warning signs, trying to identify the moment I should have realized something was wrong. The truth is, I can't. Because nothing about her behavior screamed manipulation. If anything, She was almost too good at being normal. Some of my favorite memories from that time feel almost painful now. Friday nights watching terrible dating shows while making sarcastic commentary. Sunday mornings drinking coffee before either of us had the energy to speak. Complaining about our bosses. Celebrating small victories at work. She remembered my grandmother's appointments better than some of my own relatives did. Whenever I'd mention visiting Asheville over the weekend, she'd ask how Eleanor was doing. "How's your grandma feeling?" It sounded sincere, every single time. That's the part people don't always understand about betrayal. The lie isn't convincing because it's elaborate. It's convincing because it's wrapped inside hundreds of tiny moments that all seem genuine. If someone lies to you once, you question them. If they spend months consistently acting like a good friend, you stop looking for reasons not to trust them. Around February, after we'd been living together for a few weeks, I finally mentioned the app. Not intentionally. I was making dinner while waiting for a build to finish compiling on my laptop. She glanced toward the kitchen table. "You work every night." I laughed. "Pretty much." "What are you building?" I hesitated, not because it was secret, because explaining software projects to people outside tech usually takes forever. It's basically an app for families taking care of elderly relatives. She leaned against the counter. "What kind of app?" I explained. Medication tracking, appointments, shared updates, emergency contacts, one place for everything. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she smiled. "Honestly, that actually sounds useful." I shrugged. "It helps my grandmother." "That's enough for now." She walked over to my laptop. "Can I see it?" I remember feeling proud, really proud. Nobody had asked to see it before. I opened the prototype. She spent several minutes tapping through different screens. She wasn't pretending. She explored everything carefully. "This is really clean. It doesn't feel overwhelming." That was the goal. My grandma hates complicated apps. She nodded thoughtfully. Then she asked her first real question. "What made you organize everything on one dashboard instead of separate pages?" I explained my reasoning. Families don't think in features, they think in people. Someone checking whether grandma took her medication also wants to know if tomorrow's appointment changed. Splitting everything into different sections creates unnecessary work. She smiled. "That makes sense." Then another question. "And how would you make money from something like this?" I laughed. "I honestly haven't thought that far." "You probably should." It wasn't criticism. It sounded encouraging. Over the following weeks, those conversations became normal. I'd code, she'd make tea. Then she'd sit across from me for 20 minutes asking questions. Not rapid fire, not interrogations, natural conversations. Or at least, they felt natural. What if hospitals partnered with you? Would insurance companies pay? Would families or caregivers be the customer? What happens if someone forgets to renew? How much would people realistically pay? Every question made the project stronger, or so I believed. Sometimes she'd offer marketing ideas. "You should simplify that sentence. That button stands out too much. I'd move this feature higher." Honestly, some of her suggestions were genuinely good. I used several of them. Not because I couldn't think for myself, because collaboration is normal between friends, especially when one works in software and the other works in marketing. Never, not for a single second, did I think I was giving someone a blueprint for stealing months of my life. If someone had warned me then, if someone had walked into that apartment and said, "Stop answering her questions," I probably would have laughed, because from where I was sitting, all I saw was a roommate who believed in me. Someone who stayed awake while I worked. Someone who celebrated tiny improvements no one else even knew existed. Someone who seemed genuinely excited every time I solved another problem. Sometimes trust doesn't disappear all at once. Sometimes it grows so naturally that you never realize you're planting it in the wrong person. Sometimes trust doesn't disappear all at once. Sometimes it grows so naturally that you never realize you're planting it in the wrong person. By the beginning of spring, my routine had become almost mechanical. Wake up at 6:30, get ready for work, drive across Charlotte while mentally planning whatever feature I wanted to build that night, spend 8 hours writing code for clients, drive home, make something quick for dinner, open my laptop, work until 1 or 2 in the morning, sleep, repeat. Looking back, I honestly don't know how I kept that schedule for so many months. People ask where I found the motivation. The answer isn't glamorous. I didn't wake up every day overflowing with inspiration. Most nights, I was exhausted before I even opened my laptop. Some evenings, I'd stare at my screen for 15 minutes without writing a single line of code. There were nights when all I wanted to do was crawl into bed, watch a movie, and forget the app existed until the weekend. But then I'd think about my grandmother. I'd think about how frustrated she looked every time someone called asking whether she'd already taken her afternoon medication. I'd remember how many conversations started with, "Wait, who was supposed to tell everyone about the appointment?" Or, "I thought your mom already knew." Those moments were enough to pull me back into my chair. The app wasn't changing the world, not yet, but it was making one family's life a little easier, mine, and that felt like a reason to keep going. As the weeks passed, I slowly started introducing the app to a few more people. Very few. I wasn't trying to launch a business. I was trying to find out if I was fooling myself. If complete strangers found it confusing, I wanted to know. If something didn't make sense, I wanted to fix it before investing any more time. The first families came through Denise, my grandmother's home health aide. She'd told 2 of her clients about it, exactly like she'd promised. One afternoon, she called me. "I've got another family asking if they can try your app." I smiled before I even answered. Of course. Every new user felt surreal, not because the numbers were growing, because people I didn't know were trusting something I'd built. That responsibility felt much heavier than I expected. Every bug suddenly mattered. Every crash felt personal. Every confusing button became something I couldn't ignore. I kept a notebook beside my laptop. Every piece of feedback went inside it. One page simply said, "Things Grandma found confusing." Another page read, "Questions families keep asking." I treated every complaint like free advice. Some nights I'd spend 4 hours fixing something nobody outside those 5 or 6 families would ever notice. It didn't matter. If I wanted people to trust the app, it had to deserve that trust. Paige watched all of this happen. Sometimes she'd come home around 8. I'd already be sitting at the kitchen table. She'd look over my shoulder. "Still working?" I always laughed. When am I not? She'd disappear into her room for a few minutes. Then she'd come back carrying 2 mugs of tea, one for her, one for me. "You've been staring at that screen for hours. Drink something." Small gestures, tiny kindnesses, the kind you remember long after they happen. That's what makes this story difficult for me to tell sometimes. It would almost be easier if she'd been cruel from the beginning, if she'd mocked me, if she'd acted jealous, if she'd made sarcastic comments every time I mentioned the app. Then I could point to obvious warning signs. Instead, she encouraged me. She celebrated every milestone. When I reached my first 10 active users, she insisted we order pizza. 10 people you've never met are using something you created. That's worth celebrating. It sounded ridiculous. 10 users. Most startups would have considered that a joke. But to me, it felt enormous. 10 families, 10 households, 10 sets of lives that were just a tiny bit easier because of something I'd built in my apartment after work. That night, while eating pizza from the box because neither of us felt like washing plates, she looked at me. "So, When are you finally going to admit this is becoming a real business? I laughed. It's not. It could be. I don't know. You should. She wasn't pushy. She never said, "You have to quit your job." She never filled my head with unrealistic dreams. Instead, she'd ask questions that slowly forced me to think bigger than I naturally would have. What happens if 100 families want it? What happens if it's 1,000? What if hospitals recommend it? What if insurance companies notice? I didn't have answers, not yet. But after enough conversations, I started asking myself those same questions. Around that time, I began researching other companies in the caregiving technology space. There were bigger platforms, much bigger. Companies with millions in funding, large engineering teams, beautiful offices, professional marketing. At first, seeing them was discouraging. Who was I? A junior developer writing code after work in a cramped apartment. What chance did I honestly have? One evening, I voiced those thoughts out loud. I don't think I can compete with companies like these. Paige looked up from her laptop. Why not? They already have funding. So? They have entire teams. So? They've been doing this for years. She shrugged. They're solving a problem. So are you. It's different. Is it? I hesitated. She closed her laptop. Sienna, people don't automatically choose the biggest company. They choose the one that understands them. I remember sitting there quietly. She continued. You built this because your grandmother needed it. That's a story investors actually remember. The others probably built theirs because somebody noticed a market opportunity. You noticed your grandmother struggling. Those aren't the same thing. At the time, that conversation meant everything to me. It gave me confidence I genuinely needed. Today, it's one of the memories that hurts the most, because every encouraging sentence she spoke also gave her another chance to study exactly how I thought. Months later, I'd realized she wasn't only learning my product, she was learning how I explained it, how I sold it, which parts of my story connected emotionally, which details made people care. She wasn't memorizing software, she was memorizing me. Spring slowly turned into summer. The app became faster, cleaner, more reliable. The number of active users kept climbing. 20, 30, 50, then 100. Crossing 100 users felt strangely emotional. Not because it was some magical number, because it proved something important. People weren't downloading the app out of pity. Most of them had never met me. They stayed because the app solved a real problem. Every week, I reviewed usage statistics. Which features people opened first, where they stopped, which screens confused them, which reminders people ignored. I became obsessed with understanding behavior, not to manipulate users, to remove friction. If something took 3 taps instead of 1, I wanted to know why. If elderly users struggled reading certain text sizes, I changed them. The app slowly stopped feeling homemade. It began feeling professional, not perfect, but real. One evening, after updating another feature, I leaned back in my chair and stared at the screen. For several minutes, I didn't type. I simply looked. The app no longer resembled the rough prototype I'd built months earlier. It had become something entirely different, something I could actually imagine strangers paying for. That realization scared me, because the moment an idea starts looking valuable, you start worrying about failing. Before that, there isn't much to lose. It's just a hobby, a side project, an experiment. But once you realize something might actually work, every mistake suddenly feels much bigger. What if I wasn't good enough? What if the app stopped growing? What if I'd simply gotten lucky? Those thoughts arrived more often than I admitted. People love talking about confidence. Very few talk about how often founders quietly question themselves. I questioned myself constantly. Sometimes I'd wake up convinced the entire thing was ridiculous. By lunchtime, I'd feel optimistic again. By dinner, I'd be anxious. By midnight, I'd convince myself everything was going to fail. Then I'd wake up and start over. That emotional roller coaster became normal. The strange thing was, whenever I doubted myself, Paige always seemed to know. She'd notice I was quieter than usual, or that I'd been staring at the same screen for too long. She'd walk into the kitchen. "Tough night?" I nodded. "I don't know if this is ever going anywhere." She'd pull out the chair across from me. "How many users now?" "About 100. "And they're still using it?" "Yes." "Then stop talking like nobody wants it." Simple, direct, encouraging. Exactly what I needed to hear. Or thought I needed to hear. If betrayal has taught me anything, it's that someone can tell you exactly the words you need most, without ever intending to protect your heart. By the time summer started fading, something shifted in the way I worked. Not in the app itself, but in me. I stopped seeing it as a side project I was squeezing into late nights. It started feeling like something that demanded real structure, real discipline, real planning. The number of users was no longer small enough to ignore. Every new sign-up meant a real person trusting me with something sensitive: family health, medications, routines, emergencies. That responsibility stopped feeling abstract. It started feeling heavy. So I changed how I worked. Instead of random late-night coding sessions, I began setting specific goals for each week. One week, improve notifications. Another, redesign the medication flow. Another, simplify onboarding so older users wouldn't need help. And every improvement came from the same loop: build, to test, to watch, to fix, to repeat. I didn't realize it at the time, but I was slowly building something that was beginning to resemble a real product pipeline. Not because I planned it that way, but because the users forced me into it. The app didn't belong to me anymore in the same way. It belonged to the families using it. And they didn't care about my schedule or my exhaustion. They cared whether their grandmother got the right reminder at the right time. That realization changed everything. One night, around 1:30 a.m., I was fixing a bug where medication reminders were sending duplicates. Paige was still awake too. She was sitting on the couch with her laptop, but she wasn't really working. I could tell. Every few minutes, she would glance toward me, not in a distracting way, more like she was thinking. Finally, she closed her laptop. "You're pushing yourself too hard," she said. I didn't look up. "I just need to finish this one fix." "You said that 3 hours ago." I exhaled. She wasn't wrong. I leaned back in my chair. "I can't afford for this to break for people," I said. She nodded slowly and stood up. Then she did something she often did. She walked over quietly and stood behind me, looking at the screen. Not touching anything, just observing. "You know," she said, "most apps don't survive past this stage." "What stage?" "This messy middle." I paused. "That's encouraging." "It's not meant to be discouraging." She pointed lightly at the screen. "This is where most people quit, or they stop improving, or they assume good enough is enough." I stared at the code. I don't know what good enough even means anymore. She smiled slightly. "That's a good problem to have." Then she added something that stuck with me longer than I expected. "You're building something people rely on now. That means you don't get to be casual about it anymore." At the time, I interpreted it as support, a reminder to stay disciplined. Now, I hear it differently. Because it wasn't just encouragement, it was alignment. She was learning how serious the product had become, how dependent users were, how difficult it would be for anyone else to replicate it quickly without understanding the system. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, not because I had to, but because I couldn't stop thinking about what she said. The messy middle. It felt accurate. I started reading more about early-stage startups, not because I suddenly believed I was building one, but because curiosity was growing faster than I expected. I learned about accelerators, pitch competitions, seed funding, investor expectations, traction metrics, market sizing. At first, it all felt distant, like something happening in another world. But slowly, I began to recognize patterns. The way people described problems, the way they framed solutions, the way they turned personal frustration into scalable opportunity. That last part stuck with me the most, because I realized something uncomfortable. My entire app had started from personal frustration, not market research, not trend analysis, not opportunity scanning. Just one exhausted night trying to help my grandmother. I didn't know if that made it weaker or stronger. I asked Paige about it one evening while we were eating dinner. "Do you think ideas like this can actually become companies?" I asked. She didn't even hesitate. "Of course." I frowned. "Even if they start as something personal?" "That's usually how the best ones start." She took a bite of her food. "People just dress them up later with business language." That answer made sense to me. It also made me slightly uncomfortable, though I couldn't explain why. Around that same time, something else started happening. Paige began asking more structured questions, still casual, still friendly, but different in shape, more precise, less exploratory, more targeted. Instead of general curiosity like before, her questions started sounding like someone mapping a system, not just understanding it, but documenting it internally. "What's your retention like after the first week? How many users actually complete onboarding? Which feature do people use most in the first session? If you had to monetize tomorrow, what would you choose first?" I answered them the same way I always had, openly, honestly. Because to me, she was still just Paige, my roommate, my friend, the person who brought me tea at midnight when I was too tired to function properly. But something subtle had changed, not in what she asked, but in how often she asked it, and how carefully she remembered the answers. At the time, I didn't think twice about it, because when you trust someone, you don't audit their curiosity. You just assume it's normal. That trust made everything feel safe, too safe. In early September, I was invited to apply for a regional startup accelerator. I almost didn't do it. The application felt intimidating. It asked for things like traction numbers, market analysis, long-term vision, scalability plans, none of which I had formally written down. I was still thinking of the app as something evolving naturally, not something being presented to investors. Paige encouraged me to apply. "You should at least try," she said. "It's just an application," I replied. "Exactly, nothing to lose." I remember sitting at the kitchen table filling it out while she was in the living room. Every now and then, I'd read parts of it out loud, not for feedback, just because it felt easier to think out loud. She would occasionally respond from across the room. "That sounds strong. Maybe simplify that sentence. You should emphasize the caregiving angle more." Small comments, helpful ones, or at least they felt helpful. When I hit submit, I didn't think much of it. It felt like tossing a bottle into the ocean. You don't expect anything back. 2 weeks later, I got the acceptance email. I remember staring at it for a long time, reading it again and again, just to make sure I wasn't imagining it. Then I told Paige. She smiled immediately, like she had been expecting it. "I knew it," she said. That night, we celebrated with cheap wine and takeout. It felt like a milestone, but also like the beginning of something I didn't fully understand yet. The accelerator program started soon after. Workshops, mentorship sessions, pitch practice, networking events. It was the first time I started hearing my idea described in terms I hadn't used myself. Scalable solution, market opportunity, high growth potential. Hearing my app spoken about like that made it feel slightly unreal, like someone had taken something personal and translated it into another language, a language I was still learning. And in the middle of all of that, Paige was still there, listening, asking questions, taking notes, smiling at the right moments. Still my roommate, still my friend, still the person I trusted without thinking twice. I didn't know it yet, but every single conversation we had in that apartment was quietly becoming part of something much larger than I understood. And I was the only one in the room who didn't realize the shape it was taking. The accelerator changed the rhythm of my life in a way I didn't fully appreciate at first. Before it, my world had been predictable. Work during the day, code at night, repeat. But now there were sessions I had to attend, mentors I had to meet, slides I had to refine, and a constant pressure to explain my idea in shorter, sharper, more investable ways. I remember the first time someone asked me to tighten my pitch. I stared at them for a second, not because I didn't understand the words, but because I didn't understand how you compress something that started as a late-night solution for your grandmother into a 30-second summary designed to impress strangers. But I learned quickly. You adapt or you get ignored. That became the unspoken rule of the program. Each founder in the cohort was fighting for attention in slightly different ways. Some had flashy prototypes. Some had strong technical teams. Some had previous exits or industry connections. And then there was me, the caregiving coordination app. That's how people referred to it at first. Not by name, just by category. At the beginning, I didn't mind it. But over time, I started noticing something subtle. The more people reduced my work into a category, the more they stopped seeing the personal story behind it. And that story was the only reason I was still here. Every week, we had mentor sessions. Mine were with Dr. Valerie Ose. She had this calm presence that made you feel like she was listening to every word, even when she wasn't speaking much. The first time we met, she didn't ask me about my product immediately. She asked me about my grandmother. That surprised me. Most people started with metrics, traction, market size, revenue potential. But she didn't. She leaned back slightly and said, "Tell me why this matters to you." So I did. I told her everything. The late nights, the confusion around medications, the frustration of watching someone you love struggle with systems that were supposed to help them. She didn't interrupt once. When I finished, she nodded slowly. "Good," she said. "Now we can work." That sentence stayed with me, not because it was emotional, but because it felt structured, like she was saying, "Your story is valid. Now let's build something from it." Week by week, she pushed me harder than anyone else in the program, not in a harsh way, in a precise way. She questioned assumptions I didn't realize I had. She challenged my pricing logic. She forced me to defend design decisions I had originally made intuitively. And slowly, my pitch stopped sounding like a personal explanation and started sounding like something closer to a business case. At the same time, something else was happening at home. Paige was still there, still in the kitchen when I worked late, still making tea without asking, still asking me how the app was going. But now, those conversations felt slightly different, more structured, less casual. I just didn't know why I was noticing it. One night in late September, I came home later than usual. The apartment was quiet when I walked in. Too quiet. Paige's shoes weren't by the door. Her coat wasn't on the chair. I assumed she was out with friends or working late. I didn't think much of it. I sat at the kitchen table, opened my laptop, and started reviewing feedback from the accelerator. One comment kept repeating across different mentors. Clarify differentiation. In simple terms, they were asking what made my app different from everything else already in the market. At the time, I thought the answer was obvious. It was built from lived experience. But investors don't fund lived experience. They fund defensibility. That word kept appearing in my notes. Defensible, defensible, defensible. I remember whispering it to myself at one point, like if I repeated it enough times, I'd eventually understand what it fully meant. Around 11:30 p.m., Paige came back. She looked tired, more tired than usual. I remember noticing that immediately. "Long day?" I asked. "Yeah," she said simply, taking off her coat. She didn't elaborate. She usually did. That was the first small shift I remember clearly in hindsight. Not dramatic, just less open. She poured herself a glass of water and leaned against the counter. "You're still working?" she asked. "Always," I said. She smiled faintly. "You know, most people in your position would start thinking about hiring help or scaling." I laughed. "I'm not in a position yet." "You are more than you think you are," she replied. It sounded like encouragement. It felt like support, but something about the phrasing stayed in my mind longer than usual. The next week in the accelerator, I had to present a revised pitch deck. This time, I focused heavily on structure, problem, solution, market, traction, business model. It felt strange reducing everything into bullet points, but I did it anyway. After the presentation, one of the mentors pulled me aside. "You have something here," he said, "but your narrative is still too personal. You need to make it less about your grandmother and more about the system." I nodded. I understood what he meant, but I didn't fully agree, because without the personal part, there was no reason for it to exist in the first place. That night, I went home and opened my laptop again. Paige was already there, sitting on the couch, not watching TV, just sitting. "That was today, right?" she asked. "Yeah." "How did it go?" I shrugged. "Good, I think." "What did they say?" "The usual, make it more scalable, less personal." She nodded slowly. "That makes sense." Then she paused. "But don't lose the personal part completely." I looked at her. "Why not?" "Because that's what people connect to," she said. "Everything else can be copied." That sentence should have been harmless, but for some reason I remember it very clearly. Everything else can be copied. At the time, I thought she was talking about storytelling. Now I understand it was something else entirely. By early October, the accelerator was moving toward its final pitch event. The energy in the cohort shifted. People started rehearsing constantly. Even during breaks, you could hear fragments of pitches being practiced in hallways. Everyone was tightening their stories. Everyone was preparing for judgment. And I was no different. Except I didn't realize I was also being studied. Not by investors, not by mentors, but by someone sitting just a few feet away from me every night. Paige started spending more time in her room. At first, I thought she was just giving me space to focus. But then I noticed something else. She was working late, very late, sometimes past midnight, sometimes until I was already asleep. I didn't ask questions, because I trusted the explanation I had already written in my head. She's busy. She's tired. She has her own life. Trust is often just a story you tell yourself that hasn't been challenged yet. And mine hadn't been challenged. Not yet. 3 days before everything collapsed, she started packing. I came home from work and saw boxes stacked near her door. At first, I genuinely thought she was just reorganizing. Then I saw the suitcase. "Are you moving stuff around?" I asked. She looked up briefly. "Oh, yeah." There was a pause. "I got an opportunity in Atlanta," she said. "It came up really fast. I have to relocate." It didn't sound rehearsed. It sounded sudden, even slightly stressed. I remember feeling surprised, but not suspicious, just caught off guard. "Atlanta? That's fast." "I know," she said. "I didn't expect it either." I helped her pack that night. That detail still sits strangely in my memory. Helping someone carry boxes while unknowingly helping them walk away with something you built. We talked normally, about logistics, about timing, about how sudden everything felt. Nothing in her tone suggested anything other than change of job and location. The next morning, I carried 2 boxes down to her car. We hugged. She told me she'd stay in touch, and then she drove away. I went back upstairs, opened my laptop, and kept building, because I had no reason yet to stop, not even close. The apartment felt strangely empty after Paige left. It wasn't dramatic. There wasn't some overwhelming silence where I immediately sensed something was wrong. It was simply different. For 8 months, there had almost always been another person moving around the apartment. The sound of cabinets opening, the television playing quietly in the living room, her walking down the hallway while I worked. Now, there was nothing. I remember standing in the kitchen that first evening after work, looking toward the empty second bedroom. The door was open. The room echoed. It amazed me how quickly a space could stop feeling like someone's home. I thought I'd miss having a roommate. What I actually missed was the routine, the familiarity, the feeling that someone else was awake while I chased this impossible dream. I had no idea that within a few weeks I'd wish I'd never met her at all. But at that moment, I genuinely hoped Atlanta worked out for her. I even considered mailing her one of the bakery cookies my grandmother always insisted on sending home with me after visits. That's the part that still embarrasses me. People assume victims of betrayal always have some subconscious feeling that something isn't right. I didn't. Not even a little. I was rooting for her. Completely. The timing of her move wasn't ideal with my final pitch approaching, but life happens. People change jobs, people move, people start over. There was nothing suspicious about that, or at least, nothing I recognized. With the apartment suddenly quiet, I found myself working even later than before. There were fewer distractions. No conversations over tea. No breaks to complain about work. Just me, my laptop, and the growing pressure of knowing the biggest presentation of my life was only days away. The accelerator organizers had scheduled one final rehearsal before the actual event. Every founder would have exactly 7 minutes to present. Then, 5 minutes of questions. No exceptions, no extra time. If you couldn't explain your company clearly in 7 minutes, investors assumed you didn't understand your own business. I practiced everywhere, in my apartment, in my car while sitting in parking lots before work, walking around my living room, even while brushing my teeth. Eventually, I wasn't reading the slides anymore. I was telling a story, my story. I knew exactly where to pause, exactly when to slow down, exactly which sentence usually made people lean forward. Months of practice had turned something awkward into something natural. Looking back now, that became one of the greatest advantages I had, because while someone else had copied my words, she could never copy the life that gave those words meaning. The morning of the final pitch arrived before I felt ready. I don't think anyone ever truly feels ready for moments they've imagined for months. I woke up before my alarm, 5:30. The room was still dark. I lay there staring at the ceiling. My stomach was already in knots. Not because I thought I would fail, because I cared. There's a difference. Failure scares you. Caring consumes you. I got dressed more carefully than usual. Professional, but not overly formal. I'd spent an embarrassing amount of time choosing what to wear the night before. I wanted to look like someone investors could trust, not someone pretending to be a founder. It's funny the things we worry about. As if the right blazer somehow makes your financial projections more believable. Before leaving, I called my grandmother. She answered on the 3rd ring. "You nervous?" she asked immediately. I laughed. Was it that obvious? I've known you for 24 years. You get quieter when you're nervous. She wasn't wrong. I just keep thinking I'm going to forget everything. You won't. What if I do? There was a short pause. Then she said something that made me smile. If you forget, just tell them why you built it. Nobody forgets the truth. That was Eleanor. She always found the shortest path through complicated emotions. We talked for another minute. She wished me luck. I promised I'd call afterward. Then I drove downtown. The event was being held inside a renovated warehouse that had been converted into an innovation space. Exposed brick, high ceilings, industrial lights hanging overhead. The kind of place designed to make startups feel important. Founders were already arriving when I got there. Some were pacing. Some were rehearsing quietly in corners. Others stared at laptops, making last-minute edits that probably wouldn't change anything. I recognized almost everyone from the cohort. Despite the competition, we'd spent 12 intense weeks together. There was a strange sense of camaraderie. Everyone wanted to win. Everyone also understood exactly how difficult the journey had been. One by one, we wished each other luck. Not because we expected to beat one another, because we'd all survived the same process. Eventually, we were called into the main event space. Rows of chairs filled the room. Investors, mentors, local business leaders, community members. Far more people than I'd expected. I felt my heartbeat speed up immediately. Then I saw Dr. Valerie Osei. She was already seated with the investor panel. When our eyes met, she smiled. Not a huge smile, just a small nod. A silent reminder. You've done the work. Trust it. That simple gesture calmed me more than she probably realized. The presentations began. One founder after another walked onto the stage. AI logistics, education, manufacturing, healthcare. Every company solved a different problem. Every founder believed theirs deserved funding. I listened carefully, but I also struggled to concentrate. Part of me kept mentally rehearsing my own opening sentence. Then my name appeared on the screen. Sienna Marlowe. For a split second, everything became strangely quiet. Not literally, just inside my own head. I walked onto the stage, adjusted the microphone, looked out across the audience. Hundreds of eyes, waiting. Months earlier, that would have terrified me. Instead, I found myself thinking about my grandmother, about the bakery, about that winter afternoon when coordinating one doctor's appointment had somehow turned into 4 hours of confusion. And suddenly, I wasn't trying to impress investors anymore. I was simply telling them the truth. 3 winters ago, I began. My family spent more time trying to coordinate my grandmother's care than actually caring for her. The room became very still. I kept going. I explained the problem, the frustration, the fragmented systems, the prototype, the first users, the early growth. I showed screenshots, usage numbers, retention data, everything I'd spent months refining. 7 minutes disappeared faster than I thought possible. Then came questions. One investor challenged my revenue projections. Another asked about regulatory considerations. A third questioned competition from larger healthcare platforms. Each answer felt surprisingly natural. Not because I'd memorized responses, because I'd lived the problem. Finally, Dr. Osei spoke. Her questions were different. Less about numbers, more about execution. If you receive funding, she asked, what is the first thing you build? I answered immediately. Accessibility. She tilted her head slightly. Why? Because if the people who need this most can't comfortably use it, then everything else becomes irrelevant. She nodded, no expression, just a quiet nod before moving to the next founder. When I walked off the stage, I finally exhaled. I hadn't realized I'd been carrying tension in every muscle. Several mentors stopped me afterward. Great job. Very strong presentation. You handled the questions well. I thanked them politely. But honestly, I barely heard any of it. I felt empty. Not disappointed, not excited, just finished. Months of preparation had ended in 7 minutes. That evening, I called my grandmother exactly like I'd promised. How'd it go? She asked. I smiled to myself. I think I actually did it. You sound lighter. I feel lighter. I slept better that night than I had in weeks. For the first time in months, there wasn't another presentation to prepare, another slide to rewrite, another rehearsal to schedule. Whatever happened next was out of my hands, or so I believed. 2 weeks later. Everything I thought I knew about those previous 8 months would begin to unravel. And it started with one email. It was a Tuesday morning, one of those ordinary mornings that disappears from your memory unless something happens to interrupt it. I got to the office a little before 9, grabbed coffee from the break room, opened my inbox, started working through the usual stream of client emails, bug reports, and meeting invitations. Nothing unusual. Nothing that hinted my life was about to split into 2 very distinct chapters, before that email and after it. Around 10:15, my phone buzzed on my desk. A message from Ethan. He'd been another founder in the accelerator program. We weren't especially close, but we'd gotten along well during the 12 weeks. His message was short. Hey, random question. A few seconds later, another one appeared. Have you seen this? Then a link. LinkedIn. I almost ignored it. I had work to do. I figured it was another startup article or someone sharing photos from the accelerator. Instead, I clicked it. For a second, I didn't understand what I was looking at. It was a post from a regional business incubator announcing the winner of one of their seed funding competitions. There was a smiling founder standing on stage holding an oversized ceremonial check. Behind her, a presentation slide. The company name read, Hearthlink. I didn't recognize it. I almost closed the page. Then I looked at the founder again. My hand froze on the mouse. No, that couldn't be right. I leaned closer to the screen. The woman smiling at the audience, the woman shaking hands with investors, the woman accepting congratulations, was Paige. For several seconds, my brain refused to process what my eyes were seeing. I remember actually laughing once, a quiet, confused laugh. Not because anything was funny, because sometimes your mind reaches for the least painful explanation first. Maybe she'd joined another startup. Maybe she had taken a marketing position. Maybe... Then I started looking through the rest of the photos. That's when everything changed. One slide showed the product. At first glance, it looked similar to mine. Healthcare apps often share certain design patterns. Blue buttons, calendar views, medication reminders. That wasn't enough to alarm me. Then I swiped to the next image, and the next. Every swipe made my stomach sink a little lower. The pricing structure, the family dashboard, the caregiver timeline, the onboarding flow. It wasn't just similar, it was familiar, painfully familiar. Then I reached one slide that completely took the air out of my lungs. Across the center of the presentation, in large letters, was a sentence I knew better than almost anything I'd ever written. Coordination without chaos, for the families holding everything together. I stared at it, my own words. Not inspired by mine, not rewritten, not paraphrased. Exactly. Every word. I remembered writing that sentence. It had been after midnight. I had spent nearly 40 minutes deleting and rewriting different versions. Nothing sounded right. Everything felt too corporate, too cold. Then suddenly that phrase appeared almost by accident. I leaned back in my chair that night thinking, that's it. That's exactly what this app is. I had been proud of that sentence, ridiculously proud. Now I was looking at someone else standing on stage presenting it as if she'd created it herself. I don't know how long I sat there, maybe 2 minutes, maybe 10. Time became strange. People walked past my desk, phones rang, someone laughed in another office. The entire world continued moving exactly as it had before. Mine didn't. Another message from Ethan appeared. Sienna, this is basically your app, isn't it? I couldn't answer. because saying yes would have made it real. Instead, I opened the post again, this time more slowly. I zoomed into every image, every slide, every screenshot, every chart. There were phrases I recognized from my pitch, statistics I'd personally researched, market segmentation I'd built from weeks of interviews. Even the color palette looked strangely familiar. Not identical, just close enough that my chest tightened. I whispered one sentence without even realizing I was speaking out loud. She knew. A coworker looked over. You okay? I nodded automatically. Yeah. I wasn't. Not even remotely. I closed my office door, sat back down, opened the LinkedIn post again. This time, I forced myself to look objectively. Maybe I was overreacting. Ideas overlap all the time. People solve similar problems independently. I'd read enough about startups to know that. Maybe this was coincidence. Maybe... Then I reached the final slide. Competitive positioning. 3 columns. Exactly the same comparison framework I'd built for my own investor presentation. The same ordering, the same categories, even one oddly specific phrase I'd chosen because I hated how every competitor described caregivers as users. I'd intentionally changed mine to family coordinators because I thought it sounded more human. Her presentation used the exact same wording. Coincidence evaporated. The room suddenly felt too small. I stood up, sat back down, stood up again. I wanted to call Paige. I wanted to demand an explanation. I wanted to believe there was one. Some misunderstanding, some impossible coincidence. Instead, I opened our old text conversation. Months of messages, normal messages, grocery lists, pictures of takeout, jokes, apartment bills. Then, questions. Hundreds of tiny questions. I started scrolling. How did you decide on monthly pricing? Remind me why you combined medication tracking and appointments? How many families are testing now? What did your mentor think about the subscription model? One after another, questions I'd answered without hesitation, questions that had felt like friendship. Now they looked completely different. Each message felt less like conversation and more like data collection. My breathing became shallow. I remembered nights she'd stood behind my chair watching me work. I remembered rehearsing my pitch in the kitchen. I remembered explaining why I chose certain market statistics over others. I remembered her saying, "That's a really strong way to explain it." I had smiled, thanked her, kept talking. How many times had I handed her another piece of the blueprint? 20? 50? 100? The realization wasn't instant. It came in waves. Every memory I revisited changed shape. Every conversation developed a second meaning. I felt like someone had taken the last 8 months of my life and quietly rewritten them. The friendship hadn't disappeared. It had transformed into something I no longer recognized. Eventually, I looked at the timestamp on Ethan's first message. Nearly 40 minutes had passed. 40 minutes. I'd spent almost an hour sitting alone trying to convince myself I wasn't seeing what was directly in front of me. Finally, I did the only thing I could think of. I called Dr. Valerie Osei. She answered after the second ring. "Sienna, everything okay?" I opened my mouth. Nothing came out. She waited, patiently. Finally, I managed one sentence. "I think someone stole my company." Silence. Not shocked silence. Listening silence. The kind that invites you to continue. I swallowed hard. My roommate. I think... No. I looked back at the LinkedIn photos. I know she did. Dr. Osei didn't interrupt. Didn't tell me to calm down. Didn't immediately offer advice. She simply asked one question. What happened? I told her everything, from the LinkedIn post, to the pitch deck, to the tagline, to the months of questions. She let me finish. When I finally stopped talking, she remained quiet for several seconds. Then she asked another question. When did she move out? 3 days before our final pitch. And when did she first see the app? February. Were you working on it openly in the apartment? Every night. Did she have access to your presentations? Yes. My voice sounded smaller with every answer. She continued. Did you ever send yourself drafts? Yes. Do you use version control? Every day. Are your commits time-stamped? Yes. Do you still have your early prototypes? All of them. Another pause. Then her tone changed, not emotionally, professionally. Sienna, I need you to do something. Don't contact Paige. I frowned. Not yet. First, gather everything. Every commit. Every draft. Every email. Every timestamp. Everything. I nodded instinctively before realizing she couldn't see me. Okay. Then she said something that made me stop breathing for just a moment. There may be something you don't know. What? I was invited to judge another regional pitch competition last week. My heart started pounding again. The one where HearthLink presented? I closed my eyes. You were there? Yes. I didn't recognize the founder. I'd only ever heard you mention having a roommate. But, she paused, something bothered me during her presentation. I didn't speak. I couldn't place it. The language felt strangely familiar. She exhaled slowly. Now I know why. At that exact moment, for the first time since opening Ethan's message, I felt something besides disbelief. Hope. Very small, very fragile, but real. Because suddenly, I wasn't the only person who knew the truth. Hope is a strange thing. It doesn't erase fear. It doesn't erase anger. It simply gives you something to hold on to while everything else feels like it's falling apart. When I hung up with Dr. Osai, I just sat there for a while. The LinkedIn post was still open on my monitor. Paige was still smiling in every picture. Investors were still shaking her hand. People were still congratulating her in the comments. Brilliant idea! Congratulations on solving such an important problem. Can't wait to see HearthLink grow. Every comment felt like another tiny cut. Not because strangers were supporting her. They didn't know. How could they? They were celebrating the story they'd been told, the same story I would have believed if I were in their position. I closed the browser, opened it again, closed it, opened it again. I don't know why. Maybe I was hoping something would change, that the pictures would somehow disappear, that I'd imagined all of it. Instead, the same smiling photographs greeted me every single time. Eventually, I left work early. I don't even remember what excuse I gave my manager. Probably something about a family emergency. In a way, it wasn't entirely a lie. By the time I got home, the apartment felt different again. Not because anything had changed physically, because I had. I walked into the kitchen and just stood there. My laptop was exactly where I'd left it that morning. The chair Paige used to sit in was still pushed halfway under the table. Her favorite mug, the one she'd accidentally left behind when she moved, was still sitting in the cabinet. For a second, I almost laughed. 8 months. She'd managed to take an entire business and somehow forgotten a coffee mug. I opened my laptop. Git repository. Commit history. Hundreds, no, thousands of commits. Every one stamped with a date. Every improvement documented. Every bug fix. Every feature addition. Every late night preserved. I'd always been obsessive about version control. Partly because it made me a better developer. Partly because I'd once lost an entire weekend's worth of work during college after my laptop crashed. I'd promised myself never again. At the time, that habit had felt almost excessive. Now, it looked like insurance. I started exporting everything: repositories, screenshots, archived builds, old prototypes, emails I'd sent to myself, cloud backups, design mock-ups, every file I could think of. Hours passed without me noticing. The apartment slowly grew darker as evening settled outside. I never turned on the television, never made dinner. I wasn't hungry anyway. Around 7, my phone buzzed. My grandmother. I stared at her name for several seconds before answering. "Hi, Grandma." She knew immediately. "What's wrong?" I hadn't planned on telling her. I didn't want to worry her. But the moment she asked, everything I'd been holding together started falling apart. "I think," my voice cracked, "I think someone stole the app." Silence. Then, "What do you mean?" So I told her. Not every detail, just enough. About Paige, about the presentation, about the pitch. When I finished, she didn't speak for several moments. Then she asked the question only Eleanor would ask. "Can she prove she built it?" I blinked. "What?" "You. Can you prove you built it?" I looked around the apartment at the piles of documents I'd already started collecting. "Yes, I think so." "No." Her voice became firmer. "Don't think." "Can you?" I took a slow breath. "Yes, I can." "Good." Another pause. Then she said something I'll never forget. "The truth doesn't become weaker just because someone tells a louder lie." I closed my eyes. Tears finally started running down my face. Not dramatic sobbing, just quiet tears I hadn't realized I'd been holding back all day. I trusted her. I know. I told her everything. I know. I helped her move. I know. There wasn't anything she could say to make that hurt less. She understood that. Instead, she gave me something more valuable: perspective. "You spent 8 months building something. Don't spend the next 8 months letting her take your peace, too." We talked for another 15 minutes. By the time we hung up, I felt steadier. Not better, just able to think again. The next morning, I sent everything to Dr. Osei. Not just the obvious evidence, everything. A compressed folder so large it took nearly 20 minutes to upload. Inside it was the entire history of the company: source code, development logs, design iterations, pitch deck drafts, market research, customer interviews, presentation notes, even photographs I'd taken during development whenever I wanted to compare interface changes. I realized something while organizing it all. Without intending to, I'd documented almost every meaningful step of the journey. Not for legal protection, because documenting progress had become part of how I motivated myself. Whenever I felt stuck, I'd open screenshots from months earlier. The difference always surprised me. Progress is difficult to notice while you're living through it. Looking backward makes it obvious. By noon, Dr. Osei called. "I've started reviewing everything." "Okay." "Sienna." She sounded impressed. "Did you realize how thoroughly you've documented this?" I gave a tired laugh. I always over-document. "Well, today I'm very grateful you do." She explained what she'd already found. The repository showed continuous development stretching back months before Paige's competition. The metadata matched. The email timestamps matched. The early pitch deck matched. Everything formed one uninterrupted timeline. Nothing looked manufactured. Nothing looked created after the fact. It looked exactly like what it was: a founder slowly building a product over many months. Then she told me something I hadn't expected. "I've already contacted an intellectual property attorney I trust." "You have?" "Yes. I'd like you to meet with her." I hesitated. "I've never hired a lawyer." You may not need to, but you need advice before you make your next move. She was right. Every emotional part of me wanted to call Paige immediately. Demand answers, demand explanations, demand something. But emotions don't preserve evidence. Preparation does. 2 days later, I met the attorney. Her office was much smaller than I'd imagined. No towering bookshelves, no dramatic conference room. Just a quiet office with stacks of organized folders and framed degrees on the wall. She introduced herself simply. "Call me Rachel." For almost 2 hours, she barely spoke. She reviewed documents, asked questions, compared dates, requested additional files. Every now and then, she'd make a note. Nothing about her reaction revealed what she was thinking. By the end of the meeting, I was convinced my case wasn't nearly as strong as I'd hoped. Then she finally closed the last folder. She looked at me. "Sienna." "Yes?" I don't say this often. My heart immediately started racing. "But," she tapped the stack of documents, "this is unusually well documented." I stared at her. "Really?" She nodded. "Most intellectual property disputes between individuals become arguments. One person's memory against another's, one timeline against another." She gestured toward my repository history. "You have evidence." She pointed toward my emails. "You have timestamps." She pointed toward the early prototypes. "You have evolution." Then she smiled slightly. "And perhaps most importantly, you have motive." I frowned. "Motive?" "Yes." She folded her hands together. "You built this because your grandmother needed it." She paused. "The other side will need to explain why their idea suddenly appeared fully formed, immediately after living with the person who had already spent 8 months building the same thing." "I hadn't thought about it that way," she continued. "That's a difficult story to tell convincingly." For the first time in weeks, I felt the balance beginning to shift. Not because victory was guaranteed, nothing was guaranteed, but because facts, actual documented facts, were finally entering the conversation. Rachel outlined the next steps carefully. No dramatic courtroom speeches, no threats, no public accusations. Just process, professional, methodical. "We're going to let the evidence speak before emotions do." I nodded. That sentence felt strangely appropriate, because emotions had already exhausted me. Now, it was time for the truth to do the work.